I'd like to say something about, just in general, how strategic therapists begin the process of therapy. As you probably can imagine, after some kind of social stage where you make the family feel comfortable and accepted and warm, and etc., that a great deal of the questions will revolve around what is the problem? How is this a problem? What specifically is the problem? And so quite a number of questions around the definition of the problem as seen by the family. And I would say then followed by a great deal of questions around how the family has attempted to solve the problem, and then moving directly from there into goals and indicators of change. These would be sort of the cornerstones of the first session.
Might move ahead rather quickly and rather briefly here and mention some of the standard interventions and techniques that are used in strategic therapy. The first category of techniques we would refer to as either compliance-based or defiance-based directives. And that phrase comes directly from the work of Jay Haley, but also phrased in different ways by other strategic therapists. But a compliance-based directive simply is telling the family what you want them to do, giving them real clear, concise, pragmatic direction as to the kinds of things that you would like them to do in order to change.
And even that is designed to change the problem-maintaining sequence. But the characteristic is that it's a very straight directive designed to change some family interaction. In contrast to that, you have more paradoxical injunctions. And from the strategic therapist's standpoint, those are sort of prescribing the behaviors associated with the symptom or the solutions to the symptom. And quite often, at least according to the major theorists in strategic therapy, those are designed in order that families would resist the therapist's injunction and therefore find other ways to solve the problem other than the usual problem-maintaining behaviors.
There's been an enormous amount written about paradoxical task and paradoxical prescriptions. The general notion is that you prescribe the symptom. Then by prescribing the symptom, you make it less likely that the symptom will occur, and therefore that the family or the individual will be forced to look for a new way to relate or a new way to do whatever it was that they were doing that was problematic in the first place.
Keeping in mind that in so doing, the therapist still must find a language framework that could be acceptable to the family so that they can still maintain some kind of joining and rapport so that the therapists remain believable and therefore influential.
We will here present a simulated family interview that will offer an example of interventions that might be made by strategic-oriented family therapists in working with a family. In this instance, Dr. Corrales and Dr. Rotrock will act as co-therapists. Appearing on the screen is a simple family genogram of the nuclear family unit. 19-year-old Jennifer is away at college and is not involved in the family interview. The participating family members include Marie, the mother, age 42, Mike, the father, age 43, and son Jimmy, age 16. Jimmy is the identified patient or symptom bearer. He has been making poor grades in school, has been viewed particularly by his father as beyond parental control, and recently was involved with a group of peers in a joyriding episode that the juvenile court recognized as auto theft. His father, Mike, is a salesman who travels and is away from home much of the week. Marie, the mother, is not employed outside the home.
I'd like to ask you first, Mike, if you would tell us a little bit about why the family is here, what the main problem is or the concern is that brings you here today.
Well, the main reason we're here is because of Jimmy and the difficulties he's been having at school and with the juvenile court here recently. And
Tell us, Mike, exactly what he's done.
exactly what he's done.
Yeah, that you see as a problem.
How far back do you want me to go?
Just in the recent times, like a month or two, or the last 3 or 4 months, more recent.
In the last month, he's been involved in stealing a car. He's been...
No, it was...
If you would hold just a minute, we'll get there.
He's been involved in drinking several times that I know about.
I think you're exaggerating.
And there's probably a lot of times I don't know about what's going on. And his school situation is atrocious.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, he's barely passing most of his subjects.
What kinds of grades roughly does he get?
Well, he hasn't got anything above a C- in the last couple months that I know of.
So you would consider that a problem?
Absolutely.
The grades.
Absolutely.
Given that the grades, the problems have been going on for a long time, Mike, what made you decide to come here today, say, as opposed to 2 months ago or 6 months ago?
Well, I'm really not too crazy about being here, to tell you the truth, but the school counselor thought that we ought to be here, and the juvenile court people said if he gets into difficulty again, why it's going to be serious. He'll be put on probation, or he could be institutionalized.
So it's more of an escalation of ongoing problems rather than anything major that's brought you here today. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. We'll come back to some of those points, and we'd like to hear from you, Marie, if we could. Could you tell us a little bit about why you're here?
Well, actually the school counselor called and said that she was a little concerned with some of the friends that Jim seems to have hung around with lately. But, from what I see, Jim has never been a problem to us, and I think it's just part of growing up, developmental adolescence. I don't see it as a problem. He has always passed from year to year. Sometimes the grades go up and down, but he always manages to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't really see that. I think it's really being blown out of proportion, and particularly by his dad.
What do you understand, Marie, to be the counselor's concern about Jimmy? Like, what would she say is the matter with Jimmy?
At this point, I guess she's concerned because of the last marking period, and the grades have, dropped. But that's happened before. So,
So she's concerned about the grades going down at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Out of all the concerns that Mike mentioned, which one is of the most concern to you? Would you say, for example, the grades or the behavior problems? Which of those would you say is the biggest concern that you have for your son?
I don't really see that there is such a big problem. I guess I would really be concerned that he might think that he's bad or having a problem. I don't see.
Oh, I see. So your concern is that Jimmy might think that he's got a problem psychologically or behaviorally.
Or that, that he might think he's not, that he's really so bad or, acting out, one of those tough guys. I don't see that.
Okay.
You see what the problem is, don't you? You're getting some notion of what the problem is, aren't you, doctors?
You're not home all week, and I'm home with Jimmy. You come home on the weekends, and right away, just because you're tired, everything's a big deal.
I'm expecting things to go smoothly while I'm gone, trying to eke out an existence.
Now, when you argue like this about Jimmy, what does Jimmy do most of the time whenever you go back and forth like this with arguing?
I think sometimes he goes up to his room and, looks at TV or something, or maybe goes out. I'm not really...
Does he usually leave when the two of you argue?
Sometimes. Or Might go in the kitchen.
Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. What do you say to that, Mike?
I haven't paid that much attention, to tell you the truth. I don't think he hangs around.
So you would agree with Marie that he usually leaves?
I guess he does. I don't know.
I'd like to come back to some of those things that you both mentioned and maybe ask you, if I could, Jimmy, what kind of concerns do you have?
I don't have any. There's no problem.
Are you pleased with your grades and
I'm passing.
passing?
You know, I mean, I do good when I'm in stuff that I'm interested in, but you know.
So the situation right now, that's not a big deal for you at the moment?
No, there's no really situation at all.
So you're like grades, you're okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if I like something, I'll do well. If I don't, you know, it's not that important, and I probably won't need it in life. So.
What about this big thing, or this thing with the juvenile court and the hullabaloo around that? Do you see that as a problem?
He blew it all out of proportion. It was not a big deal. A little acquaintance of mine, he borrowed a car. He didn't say he stole it or anything. So, you know, he said, "You want to go for a ride?" So sure, it was, just driving around, having a good time, just an innocent time.
No big deal, huh?
That's right.
Is it okay, Marie, if we ask your son these questions just directly? Is that all right with you? Okay.
Should we ask something that you think you want to explain to us a little bit more? Feel free to let us know.
Oh, thank you.
And, for you too, Mike, if he says something that you need to explain to us, why? Just let us know.
That I can clarify?
Yes, please. It would be helpful to us.
All right.
You may note the general family pattern. Mother acts to protect the son by explaining his behavior and attempts to blunt father's interventions. She is the placater. It is obvious that there is unresolved tension between father and mother, and yet the outbreak of the conflict is between father and son. In the diagram, you will note father is the more distant part of the triangle. The heated side of the triangle is between father and son, with the closeness between mother and son. At this point, the family discusses their efforts at solutions. The therapist uncovered the major solutions. Father prefers grounding, withholding privileges, withholding the use of the car. Mother tries understanding, caring, encouraging self-esteem. We will return to the family as they examine goals.
If we were to ask each one of you, what would you like to have happen for Jimmy? And then if you could give us maybe some idea as to how you would know if things are beginning to go well.
We're looking here for some small indication that Jimmy might still not be doing as well as you would like, but some small sign that if Jimmy were to do it, that would tell you that things are going better, that he's at least making a step in the right direction in terms of his own improvement.
We would start with you, Mike.
Well,
what would you like to have happen for your son?
I guess if I was just to pick one major thing, it would be to have his grades pick up. If he were to raise his grades up to even B's and C's, why that would indicate he's probably spent a little more time studying and not as much time with those so-called friends of his. I guess that would be it.
Okay, so one of your goals is like better grades around B and C, right?
At least,
If
yeah.
you found out, either through Marie or through your own observation, that Jimmy was starting to study perhaps 15 minutes at a time here and there, would that be a change?
I think it probably would.
Okay, it wouldn't be enough, but you would consider that a significant step.
That would be a step.
What about for you, Marie? I know you're much more pleased with Jimmy than Mike is these days, but what would be an indication for you that Jimmy's doing even better than he is now?
Well, I'm sure if his grades improved and then his school counselor would agree, you know, and not be concerned, that certainly would say that that was going real well. And it has done that in the past, you know. Okay.
So you agree with Mike
Yeah.
in that regard? That may be the only thing you've agreed on, but you do agree with that.
I agree with that.
Mike, Jimmy, did you want to add anything, any last comment on
Go ahead. Speak up.
what you would like to see happen?
You know, I just like for, you know, him to stay off my back and,
Just to stay off your back.
you know, quit bitching all the time at me and stuff.
And you think that if you did that, you would be better?
Yeah, it would, you know, it would, I don't know. I'd like to be able to have a regular dad and have a good relationship, but, you know, I can't do it by myself.
Do you think if you made better grades and studied more, he would stay off your back?
Well, that's what he says, but
On the screen, you will see an outline of the territory covered in the initial interview. At this point, Dr. Corrales and Dr. Rotrock discuss the initial interview.
This is a fairly typical first interview where we really focused on what the problem is. And just briefly, we see the family struggling with what we call a responsibility problem, where father thinks that the son is basically irresponsible, and mother is still concerned about the responsibility, but she believes that, protective as she is, her son is in fact doing things semi-responsibly.
We see this as a preferable frame compared to a so-called sick frame, where the boy's behavior would be seen as somehow sick or disturbing, sometimes phrased more gently as an indication of low self-esteem or some problem that's more internal to the boy. So we see the frame, i.e. the responsible frame, as an easier one to work with and one that has a better prognosis for success than a so-called sick frame.
Partly because it can be verified. If he gets better grades, then we will know it. If he's studying, we will know it, which is a little bit more difficult than, say, the boy is emotionally disturbed.
In terms of the function of the symptom, of Jimmy's symptom, we saw it as having two main functions. One was it had the function of bringing in father, and we had a sense that the father was quite distant, tended to work all the time, but once Jimmy got into difficulty, into trouble, then that tended to bring father in rather rapidly to try and help Jimmy or to correct Jimmy's problem behavior.
They got him into the web of the emotional fabric of the family. And then the other function that I saw was that typically the arguing as a sequence would start between mother and father, and then although it was about Jimmy, and eventually when father got heated up enough, and Jimmy would step in, and then the heat would be between father and son, thus detouring some of the real heat between husband and wife or father and mother. And in that sense, it had a fairly significant function for the system.
I agree. It's also in a very classic type of triangulation that if you're doing private practice or agency work, you'll see this kind of problem time and time again in your office. It's a sort of problem that it's sort of a mainstay, I guess, of therapists, where it's somewhat of a classic triangle where father and mother, or rather the son and mother, are allied with father out.
And with the heat being on one side of the triangle, in this case, mainly between father and son, after an initial heating of the husband-wife relationship. And not very much into the limelight here, but somebody we need to be aware of is the older sister, Jenny, who probably has some kind of a covert but significant tie with father.
You might note the way we're thinking about the symptom or the problem, and there are many ways always to think about a particular symptom or a problem. And we're thinking about it here in terms of threes, in terms of father, mother, and Jimmy. And consequently, the type of intervention or solution that we will use later will involve all three of them. So we're conceptualizing or thinking about Jimmy's problem outside of himself. We're conceptualizing it as a relationship type of problem between mother, father, and Jimmy.
Now, the area that strategic therapists will utilize quite a bit in formulating a treatment plan is the area of sequence of behavior or the solution to the problem. And you'll notice that whenever Jimmy gets into any kind of a situation, part of the sequence is father will talk to mother, mother will start to sugarcoat a little bit and protect the son. Father then increases the investigative quality of his questions. Somewhere down the road, he'll find out that something went wrong, either through the school, juvenile court, or mother might slip out something, or Jimmy might slip something out. And then he'll start to use what we might call the big stick as a way to solve the problem. And mother then protects the boy, trying to provide a lot of the softness. And so when mother provides the softness, father probably wants to get more punitive. When father wants to become more punitive, mother provides more softness. And thus the boy is not only caught up in the triangle, but has a way to nullify the effect of the hierarchy.
It's interesting because clearly the father was the one who was most upset. However, my hunch is that initially it was the mother who would be upset by some problem behavior of Jimmy, but her own anxiety then would be transferred to the father. This is not terms that strategic therapists would use, but her own kind of dissatisfaction would then be transferred to the father simply by telling him in tidbits what Jimmy was doing. And the father then would, of course, get very upset and go through the sequence that you just elaborated on, Ramon.
So in summary, our main goal here in doing the treatment plan would be to find a way to unify the hierarchy so that they can do their work in a manner that is still respectful and compatible with their own understanding and belief.
That we want to somehow break the destructive sequence of behavior and offer them more constructive solutions to solve Jimmy's problem.
An important part of strategic therapy is the giving of directives to the family on the part of the therapist. This may occur as early as the last part of the initial interview. Here we see the therapist engaged in such a process.
We know that there are several concerns in the family. The one we'd like to focus on, primarily because we believe that this is what you're concerned about, is Jimmy's schoolwork. And we would like to share some things with you that we believe would be helpful to Jimmy, and we will need a lot of your cooperation to do that.
My thinking is that if Jimmy can get some success and do better in school, it'll be a pretty clear sign that he's doing better in life in general, and that he'll be more responsible. It'll be a pretty good indicator of his increased responsibility. And what we'd like to do is propose something, and then we'd like to ask you if you're willing to do it between now and the next time that we would meet again. We're hearing that the two of you have different styles in relating to Jimmy.
It's an understatement.
And maybe along that line, different solutions as to how you feel like it's best to help Jimmy at this stage in his life. And what we'd like to do, Marie, is to go with your style first and ask you between now and the next time that we would meet in 2 weeks, if you would be willing to give Jimmy lots of attention, love, care, consolation, whatever you feel like that he needs in order to do better in school. Mm-hmm. And we're assuming that if your method then is effective, that what we will see is increased study on Jimmy's part, which would eventually translate into improved grades. Mm-hmm. Okay? And at the end of the 2-week period, and we'll say more about the specifics of this in just a moment, but we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of your solution. And if it should not be effective, we would then like Mike to go with your solution, which would be maybe a little tougher than Marie's, and have you try your method to see indeed which one is best, because we see both of you have the same goal in mind, which is really to help Jimmy do better in school. Are we correct about that?
Sure.
That you really want your son to do better in school?
Your style, Mike, as I understand it, is that if Jimmy could have more specific consequences for all of his wrongdoing, that you believe he'll do better.
Absolutely.
And we want to hear that very, very carefully, but are asking you, are you willing to let Marie's solution for at least 2 weeks? Would you be willing to give it a try?
Well, does this mean that he has no discipline for the next 2 weeks?
Well,
is that
maybe
basically what
we'll
we're
hold
talking
off.
about here?
We'll hold off on that until we're through with our instructions. But maybe I'll just leave that for you to think about for the moment. Okay. Now, what this means, Marie, I hope we're making this clear, is if at the end of the 2-week period, when we get back together here, if there is absolutely no evidence that Jimmy is doing better, and that will be decided by the two of you as parents and by the two of us as therapists, we will review the information of the previous 2 weeks. And if we as a group decide that Jimmy is indeed doing a little bit better, then we'll continue with your solution. If there is no evidence that he is doing better, our task would be that you must then agree to let Mike follow his own nose. And then we would give him a chance for the following 2 weeks to utilize his solution. This is part of the agreement too.
Are you willing to do that for the next 2-week period?
Surely, will certainly be willing to try anything. I guess, am I understanding, though, that there would have to be an improvement in grades in 2 weeks? That's kind of
Not
hard
grades,
to...
not
Okay.
grades, but studying. If he's studying, if he's bringing his books home, if there's evidence that he is actually doing the work that down the road might get him better grades.
Okay.
During this 2-week period, Mike, we'd like to ask you to observe Jimmy's behavior especially close, to see if he is indeed bringing books home, studying. It's okay to be a bit of a snoop. Would you mind to do that when you're home?
No, that's
To watch, but don't comment on Jimmy's study habits.
no comments.
No comments.
Either
Just observe.
Just observe.
no comments to Jimmy, and in order to keep her solution in a purified form, you're not to make any suggestions to your wife about how to handle Jimmy, only during the next 2 weeks.
How about information? Can I get information?
Not directly from Marie, just through your own observation.
We'd like to ask in that vein, Marie, if you would not report to Mike anything about Jimmy the next 2-week period.
Okay.
Could we ask that you do that?
Sure. Actually, that's better for everyone.
Okay. The other thing that we'd like to ask you to do, Mike, is that for you to spend a little bit of time with Jimmy, one time this week, one time next week. Some short amount of time that would just be contact, friendly contact.
And Marie would like for you, if you would, please, to coach Jimmy a little bit on, maybe give him some tidbits on how to get along with his father, because I think he needs some help in that area. And as a final thing, very important for us as therapists is during the next, while we're working with Jimmy here, that the two of you agree to put your marriage on the back burner and totally concentrate your energies on helping Jimmy.
So that all your focus for now will be here. Could we ask you to do that?
Sure, that's why we're here, really.
Would that be all right with you, Mike?
We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
A brief discussion of the family assignment or directives follows.
What we were attempting to do in this brief intervention period with the family, one of the things we were attempting to do, I should say, was to block the behavioral sequence that we observed during the initial contact with the family. And we were wanting to do that by eliminating essentially the function of the symptom, and also by rerouting it. So we were attempting to block father's involvement and to begin the early stages of a healthier kind of connection and contact with his son.
One of the ways we blocked the symptom or the behavioral sequence was by asking father simply to observe Jimmy and not to make comments directly to Marie, because that's how the whole interaction sequence started. And in terms of eliminating the function of the symptom and rerouting it, we tried to get a task whereby father and son, with mother's help directed to the son, whereby father and son might do something more on a friendly basis. Now, frankly, we're a little pessimistic about whether that can actually happen. But whether it happens or not, it will be information for us that we can utilize then in the following session.
Our hope would be that by having father as an observer and blocking his direct conflict with his son, this will give him enough interest so that he'll stay involved. And in addition to that he could look forward to the possibility of trying his own method once Marie's method fails.
I guess that's one of the ways to keep father interested, that should mother fail in her attempt to help the son, his own solutions would kick in. By sequencing the solutions that way, we hope to prevent a power struggle whereby father and mother are simultaneously competing for whose solution is going to work, thus therefore nullifying the effect of the hierarchical moves.
The idea also of encouraging the parents to focus on their son's behavior rather than to focus on their marriage may seem evident or obvious to most of you, but it's hopefully to relax the couple and to not get derailed from working on Jimmy's problem by erupting into a marital conflict of sorts.
If you ask why we decided to start on mother's solution, the answer is that she is much more involved with Jimmy, much more involved in the symptom, and therefore as long as we kept father somewhat interested through some tasks, we felt like we could get better cooperation from the family.
Dr. Corrales and Dr. Rotrock, in conclusion, offer summary thoughts in relation to strategic family therapy.
Turning from discussion specifically of the family, perhaps now to looking at an overview of strategic family therapy, both in terms of its strengths and limitations.
The first strength that we'd like to highlight is the idea that there's a certain clarity of thinking about the problem and the solution that's very refreshing in strategic therapy work. That it tends to be results-oriented, as we've mentioned earlier. There tends to be a high level of accountability for results, which is quite refreshing in our work, because a great deal of therapy doesn't really do that.
I really like that clarity portion, because it not only clarifies the thinking about the family, but I know in doing some of the work strategically, it clarifies my own position. And when I, as a therapist, am very clear about what I'm thinking and what I'm suggesting, I think the work with the family goes much better. And certainly that is one of their strengths.
It's axiomatic that so much of psychotherapy is so vague and so ambiguous that even when you get success, it's very difficult to know what it was that created the success, and in cases where it's failed, it's hard to know what you did or did not do that led to the failure.
And secondly, there's a lot of emphasis on the therapeutic system as such, the kind of interaction that goes forth between therapist and client, rather than just an over-focusing on what's going on out there with the family. The therapist is included in the unit of analysis, thus leading to much greater flexibility when to give directives and when to give perhaps more prescriptive injunctions, like paradoxical injunctions.
Closely related to that is an advantage that in strategic therapy you're much less likely to do harm to the patient. if you want to look at it like that. That you don't keep them around forever, for one thing. So consequently, there's not unhealthy dependencies that tend to develop between patient and therapist.
I guess you and I have seen so many casualties among patients where they were labeled and given a very bad frame, something like narcissistic or other frames like that. In strategic therapy, therefore, there's much less of the chance of coming up with a bad frame, a frame that's not useful, and that certainly is one of its strengths.
Another strength we might highlight would be to mention that because of its brief nature, the therapy tends to be highly affordable to a large number of people. And since strategic therapy was somewhat of a reaction to psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis tended to have many shortcomings, and one of those was expense. If you met with the patient 3 or 4 times a week, it could become quite expensive.
For the next
10 years, and it could be quite expensive. So even at the current rates of $70 to $90 per session, psychotherapy tends to be quite affordable and effective, used in the strategic mode for large numbers of people.
Now, like all models, a model is designed to guide our own thinking and our own behaving in such a way as to help us map a territory. There are, however, some blinders. And one of those is that the over-focusing on a symptom and symptom resolution will often get a strategic therapist defocusing somewhat on the family system as it is structured. And we had the case very recently of an 8-year-old girl, if you remember, who said, "I have nightmares, and if my mother would only let me sleep with her at night," the mother was divorced, that the nightmares would go away. And we were convinced that if she did that, the nightmares would go away. However, systemically, the structure of the system would be worse off, and potentially, possibly, that family could go on without symptoms till the girl is about 13.
Just to build on that point for a moment, is that it's possible to argue that strategic therapy is sometimes too lean, that there's not enough of an appreciation for one's history or a family's history and how that history can be used constructively in the therapeutic process.
Another point, Larry, would be in the area of accountability or responsibility. Now, I know we mentioned that accountability is in fact one of the strengths of strategic therapy. But I know in our own experience, when we get into a frame of mind that we are totally, absolutely, totally responsible for any change in the family, it becomes pretty heavy. And I know that I become less flexible, more worried, and therefore probably less in touch with my own resources as a therapist.
In addition, it's possible to assume so much responsibility for the change that the family or the individual takes the complement of that. In other words, they assume less. So what you have is a situation where, as a result of assuming too much responsibility for change on the part of the strategic therapist, the family will actually assume less of the responsibility. And thus the strategic therapist may unwittingly take away some of the initiative from the individual or the family.
And I would like to make a note on paradoxical interventions, that if a student reads the literature on paradox, he or she might get the notion that it's a sort of tricky, cutesy type of intervention where I'm going to say something to the family, quote, so that they will do the opposite. That kind of a frame, I would say, is a power frame, and it could get a therapist into a kind of manipulative frame of being invested in the outcome. I'm going to do this so that they'll do this. And I think that a better way to think about paradoxical prescriptions is to say that you will respect the energy in the system, utilize it, perhaps prescribe it, but with the intent that whatever they do with it is something that I would respect and not be disappointed if they don't do what, quote, I wanted them to do. And I think that's a limitation to think that way.
Another potential side effect or potential problem with strategic therapy is that you can develop a whole arsenal of techniques and methods that are extremely effective in changing families. And once you use those techniques time and time again, the techniques can become stagnant or stale. So they take on a routinized quality to them. And if you look, as we do, of doing this perhaps for the rest of our lives, then your arsenal may not be complete enough such that you can develop a sense of excitement about the process of change. So a technique can become extremely fascinating the first 5, 10 times you use it. The next 20, 30, 40, 50 times, there can be a kind of deadness about it that's not good for the therapist. And it's hard to imagine that the client or the patient would not pick up on that kind of deadness. And eventually the therapist can become quite burned out and see himself or herself as a mechanic, somewhat robotical.
More like a plumber.
More like a plumber, taking the life out of what's potentially a very exciting kind of growth process for the therapist.
And perhaps as a final note, since strategic therapy grew out partially as a response or in contrast to psychoanalysis, where everything was thinking about what was going on inside the person, with so much emphasis on interaction and structure, and a lot of almost skepticism about feelings and cognition, that occasionally strategic therapists begin to live in a world as if the self does not exist. There's a kind of negation of the centrality of the self.
So as a reaction to that kind of previous therapy, strategic therapists may have gone too far in negating the self, in effect, and negating some of the useful aspects of self-psychology.
And I would just like to make a plug for the notion that self and system are two different levels of the same reality, and that they both co-evolve together, and therefore I would like my theory to be much more sensitive to self as I continue to be sensitive to the dance between and among selves.
I think without question, in summary, strategic therapy has made an enormous contribution to the field of psychotherapy. That their achievements, the theory will live on, but that it's still a limited kind of model, and that it's left up for future theoreticians, modelers to go ahead and take the strategic paradigm and improve upon it. Because I think in and of itself, it's a limited paradigm, while at the same time recognizing that it was an enormous improvement over previous methods of psychotherapy and change.
And it is a strategy or a paradigm that can be incorporated in an integrative way with other models of family therapy. What it does is it really highlights for me the importance of the therapeutic system, but that within that frame, I think one can use other forms of theory to understand the system perhaps better. One can take structural therapy, Boehnian therapy, other forms of understanding the system, and then move on to strategic therapy to answer the question, how does the therapist position himself or herself in order to help this family move from point A to point B?